Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the final session of today's events. My name is Joseph Gabriel. I'm an associate professor at the College of Medicine at Florida State University. I'm really pleased to be here and to be a part of this wonderful event. So before we start, I'd just like to say thank you to Luke and Kristen and Greg Bond and everyone else who's clearly put in a tremendous amount of work to be a part of this really excellent conference. So as we've been doing in other sessions, please make sure you turn off your video camera and mute your mic unless you're speaking. Please put questions into the chat box and I'll read them for Professor Campbell at the conclusion of her talk. And it's really, my distinct pleasure today to introduce Nancy to everyone. Dr. Campbell, as I'm sure most of you know, is professor and department head in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's also co-editor of the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs, and she's published extensively on history and politics of scientific approaches to habitual drug use, with a particular focus on gender and addiction and the interactions between scientific communities, treatment providers, policymakers, patient advocates, and other groups. Professor Campbell, as we know, has been remarkably prolific. She's published lots of articles and a list of her many books you can see on the screen. And today she's going to be talking to us about her most recent work, OD, Naloxone and the Politics of Overdose, which just came out with MIT Press. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the session over to Nancy. And I think we all very much look forward to hearing about your exciting new work.
Well, today I'm going to begin with a bit that a few of you are going to find familiar. If you heard my keynote last year in Shanghai for the Alcohol and Drugs History Society, which you should all join. So please consider membership. And I promise that's my last promotion. But I also promise that there will be some new material that I am talking about today really for the first time, because I began to think about what would it mean to center the role of pharmacy and pharmacists in some of the stories that I tell. And so this is also the end of a grand 3 days. And so I will also endeavor to do a little bit of entertaining. So of course, the book asks the question, the obvious question really, why did it take so long for naloxone to get into the hands of people who need it most? Naloxone, as most of you probably know, is a narcotic antagonist that was synthesized in the early 1960s. No one really saw a market for it, and it was approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 1971, almost 50 years ago, to reverse opioid overdose from narcotic agonists. So today there's a little pharmacology lesson, so listen for it. So today, of course, many people do know what naloxone is, and many even may carry it. But for the first several of its 9 lives, no one did, except perhaps for the occasional, well, let's see, I'd like to advance, paramedics, anesthesiologists, and of course, pharmacists. The book asks then, when, where, and how did overdose and naloxone come to matter? Why did it take so long for naloxone to break out and leak out of medicine and into the streets? When did it become a vehicle for positive change, part of a social movement, something for which state governments and county public health departments are now responsible for delivering curbside? How did it get to be so expensive? Who saw the potential for naloxone to become a technology of solidarity, and how did they go about making it so? So the book is full of answers to these questions, but one of them is not that there was no need for naloxone until recently. This project was actually catalyzed by a harm reduction activist who was working in public health in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in response to overdose deaths taking place in broad daylight on Boston Commons, very symbolic ground in the United States. And she had read an article, A History of Buprenorphine, that I had published with Ann Lovell, which involved interviews of dozens of people who brought that partial agonist antagonist to market. And that story had begun back in the 1960s at the Addiction Research Center at the Lexington Narcotic Farm. And she got in touch to say that I had forgotten about naloxone. Could I please write something about naloxone? And I thought, well, yes, I'll do that. I'll write a little article about naloxone. I thought it was a relatively inner ingredient in Suboxone, but I knew that these folks at the Lexington Narcotic Farm had thought about what they called a magical ratio or a magical mixture of agonists and antagonists together, and that they had imagined this. And so I began to build a sense of why. When I began to think, well, why overdose? Why do overdose deaths begin to rise in the 1950s? And I began to look into the history of overdose and found changing patterns, of course, of opiate availability in the immediate post-war period, and also intravenous administration, leading to new demographic patterns of admission in Lexington starting in 1951. Just a brief bit on Lexington. The narcotic farm had opened in 1935 to serve a largely poor white male clientele with a median age of 45 years. So prior to the war, that was what the modal patient looked like at Lexington. And the research team there had agreed in the mid-1930s to take on solving what was then called the opium problem. The 1929 New Deal for the drug addict led to the opening of a congressionally mandated research laboratory inside this narcotic farm, where clinical research could be conducted with men who were remanded to drug treatment as felons under the Harrison Narcotic Act. That laboratory was housed inside this facility, 1,500 beds, built around a courtyard the size of 3 American football fields. So in much of my work, I've asked this kind of question. I added, for your enjoyment today, the question of what happened to all those cows, because today we're going for the first time ever into the basement. This is the basement of the narcotic farm. This is the beef class, vocational training and therapy. If you've read the recent Points blog responses to American Rehab, you know a little bit about the history of vocational therapy for the addictions that took place at the narcotic farm. And so for many years, but this is a pharmacy that was also in the basement of the narcotic farm. For many years, I've been trying to escape from the narcotic farm. But I've always continued interviewing people who were there, who have contacted me because they've heard a talk or read something of mine. And a couple of them have trained as pharmacists and worked in one of the 2 pharmacies in the narcotic farm. The one upstairs was for the research lab. The one downstairs was for the rest of the institution. And this was a path to social mobility for poor white Kentuckians, several of whom grew up to be pharmacists or PharmDs, or in the case of Jewel Sloan, PhDs, as a result of living on the grounds of the narcotic farm as graduate students at the University of Kentucky. They had rather sumptuous apartments set aside for them. They could look down on that courtyard. From what I have been able to determine from these interviews, they made finished products that were supplied to the residents, such as differently colored aspirins. There were red ones and green ones, shampoo, which was sold in the commissary, and other such products, but they also, of course, made drugs. The narcotic farm was not just a prison. It was also a fully equipped, almost fully equipped hospital, I should say. They did not have an obstetric unit, despite admitting women from 1941 on. But one of the main activities going on in that basement pharmacy was the making of 50-gallon drums of red methadone syrup. Methadone was used in detox at Lexington after 1948, when it was brought as a spoil of war to the ARC and studied for its clinical utility. Felons, who comprised 2/3 of that population, the general population, did not typically arrive at the farm actively addicted, but voluntary patients did. So they came in and needed to go through detox. And they did that over a 10-day to 2-week period. And one of the philosophies of the narcotic farm as a treatment facility was that detoxification should be pharmaceutically supported, right? It should not be, quote, cold turkey. And really, methadone was by far, since methadone is an agonist, by far the best withdrawal agent. They, of course, sought to mitigate the effects of withdrawal, which they called the morphine abstinence syndrome. They understood, because the early science of this place was to establish that syndrome, they understood, in effect, what this form of detoxification was. So methadone, tapered across the detoxification period after 1948, was the most helpful agent they had identified. They did not, by the way, think that methadone maintenance therapy, which of course is quote, discovered or pioneered by Vincent Dole and Marie Neiswander in the mid-1960s in New York, they did not think that was a good idea. They did not think at the narcotic farm that maintaining anyone on an agonist for very long was a good idea. So the, as you can probably imagine, these spaces are pretty secure. This is an Abbott Labs. Many pharmaceutical companies actively worked with the people at Lexington, because Lexington did all of the human testing on analgesics prior to their entrance onto the market, as a consequence of its role as the clinical testing site for the Committee on Drug Addiction and Narcotics, which coordinated the search for a non-addicting analgesic through NIH since the 1930s. So if either of you have, if you've read either Caroline Acker's or my books on this topic, you'll realize that this was even before the anti-malaria the studies of malaria prophylaxis during the war, that this was a massively coordinated federal research project that everyone seems to have forgotten because it had to do with addiction. So anyway, here we are. So as a result, Lexington often had new drugs on the shelf that were untested or were in preparation for testing. And one of these drugs was a Merck product called NALORPHINE or NALORPHINE, and that's the first narcotic antagonist, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. It reverses opioid overdose, albeit with a few more dysphoric effects than naloxone, which is known as a cleaner drug. So with methadone came concerns for the institution about overdose. In the early 1950s, due to the first mandatory minimums of the Boggs Act, the demographics of narcotic farm admissions began to change. And that's partly because of changes in law enforcement and partly because of changes that I talked about earlier about the new flush of availability of needles, syringes, and heroin. So while the majority of admissions to Lexington continued to be white and always were, there was a discernible shift in the 1950s, from the early 1950s on, towards African American and Puerto Rican patient inmates. The narcotic farm, by the way, did treat all of the everyone from Puerto Rico and from Puerto Ricans in New York City. So the 200 plus subject trials of methadone that were conducted by the ARC, as it was named after 1948, were the largest studies that the ARC had ever done to that date. And I should say something about the sample size, the subjects pool sizes were very small at Lexington. The research ward was small. And although it expanded over the years at times, typically the early studies only involved 6 subjects at a time. Contemporaneous with the methadone studies were the beginnings of the LSD studies at Lexington. And those were conducted, I believe, entirely on African American men. Because at the ARC, there were so many studies of LSD that were conducted on white men that they decided to differentiate themselves because they had a pool of African-American male subjects. That, of course, the racial politics of that looks very different to us than it did to them. So anyway, the vast majority of subjects, over 200 in the methadone trials, were white, but there were a small number of African-American men, and 2 of them overdosed from cumulative low doses of methadone in one of those studies. This is a before and after picture that was published in the medical literature. And during that study, in order to reverse this overdose, this comatose patient, human subject, was administered NALOXONE, which had equivocal results. In other words, there had been a few clinical encounters involving NALOXONE and its use for opioid overdose, but nothing definitive. And so this study really showed that this was definitive, right? They talk about the cyanotic state, and then you see the subject 4 hours after administration of NALOXONE, and they talk very rousingly in the for a scientific article out of the ARC about the fact that this young man would have lost his life if not for the NALOXONE, which was on the shelf because Merck had supplied it. Merck regularly supplied things to researchers. And NALOXONE became something that was advertised in the medical press for heavily narcotized patients, and that included, by the way, these ads also mention heroin. So not only, this is a visual depiction of what's called bagging, which is what was done to reverse opioid overdose. So medicine, however, was not the only profession interested in NALOXONE. While many people like to say that the war on drugs started during the Nixon era, or maybe Dwight D. Eisenhower, it had actually been gathering steam for some time, even at the local level. These are police in Humboldt County in Northern California, teamed up with the police in Oakland, California, the Alameda police, and made NALOXONE a new weapon in the narcotics war. They deployed NALORPHINE as a method of detection. These are, by the way, the police are the photographs are of the police, not of addicted individuals. So they deployed NALORPHINE as a means of detection, surveillance, and social control. And these so-called NALOXONE clinics, which are depicted on the bottom of this frame, and these were distributed widely throughout the state of California and other states in the 1950s and 60s, and places like Singapore and so forth. And several operated in LA. And I choose LA to talk a little bit about the idea here, right, was that heroin users would be deterred from further use of heroin if they had to go through weekly NALOXONE tests, which involved injection and observation of pupillary response and other signs of rapid withdrawal. NALOXONE was a very unpleasant and dysphoric drug to have injected if you had an opiate in you. So the police masterminds of this project reasoned that they could deter use and control the movements of drug users. They thought it would prevent them from moving into jurisdictions where there were active NALOXONE clinics. Few were deterred, as we know from the plaintiff in this case, who was enrolled in a NALOXONE program as a condition of parole, but who died of an overdose in an alley in LA nearly a year before this case, which was a typo, I'm so sorry, reported beneath such headlines as "Drug addiction ruled no crime," but is often cited as a kind of liberal support for the idea that addiction was a disease rather than a crime, which was, of course, an active debate throughout this period, and particularly in the 1950s and 60s. So what was interesting to me was that NALORPHINE did not go away quickly when naloxone came onto the scene. And many of us probably remember this particular book, but it says quite explicitly that better distribution of NALORPHINE should make the death of anyone due to heroin overdose very rarely excusable, published in 1972. So well after naloxone was approved in 1971, NALORPHINE still appeared, and NALINE clinics were kind of still online. Naloxone only gradually seeped into use, largely through emergency medicine and pre-hospital care. And so there were many dreams about what you could do with an agent like naloxone. In other words, they're always thinking, what can we do with this new drug, right? I'm not going to read these out, but I want you to imagine you're somebody like William Martin or Jules Sloan and thinking about, all right, so what? So what about pharmacists? Broader access to naloxone was actually first implemented in the late 1980s. In northern Italy. So there's a long period between the early 70s and the late 1980s, despite the fact that lots of people have this kind of idea, right, that it might be useful. And so in northern Italy in the late 80s, there was a heroin overdose concentrated epidemic, and pharmacists, nurses, and medical students built a rapid response system in which they would rush out to train platforms. But what they didn't do was create evidence. They didn't document what they were doing. They didn't really create evidence. And so when in the early 1990s, a number of pharmacological thinkers get the idea in the UK, in Australia, that there might be something to take home naloxone. Now, it's interesting that in the United States, although we had that idea, it was only a very few people, and that was largely because in the United States, harm reduction did not percolate out into the healthcare system as it did in, say, the UK. We had a much more confrontational social movement going on at that time, and it took that kind of confrontation in order to get paraphernalia laws, repealed. We had this is quite a group of luminaries in the harm reduction world. They started meeting in 1993, the Harm Reduction Working Group, and Dan Bigg at the Chicago Recovery Alliance, who set up a national hub and negotiated with suppliers of naloxone and found physicians to write standing orders, is in the front row in the white shirt. And they of course morph into the Harm Reduction Coalition. So part of what's going on in the 1990s in the US is that antiretrovirals are beginning to make OD visible. In other words, people are living with HIV, living with AIDS long enough to die of overdose first. And this begins to become known and studied in the context of San Francisco. So in January of 2000, Open Society Foundations convenes a group in Seattle to figure out how to distribute naloxone more systematically. Now, I want to point out that in the year 2000, there are only about 14,000 overdose deaths in the United States. Only about 14. I can't stand it when I say things like that. But as you know, that number has gone up and up and up. This is a CDC graph that also very clearly illustrates that rise in fentanyl beginning in 2013. That's the synthetic opioid overdose deaths that you see there. And that is, by the way, largely responsible for the increase in opioid overdose deaths among African American communities. So during this time, you begin to see a kind of proliferation of overdose death and overdose. People begin to realize that people often survive overdose, and naloxone is key to that survival. And so there begin to be activists, right, who begin to create protocols. They begin to create education materials. They begin to create training programs. They begin to work within states. I know some of you are here on this, attending this session, who were very important, working with your states, like places like the state of New Mexico, one of the first. They crashed, FDA hearings to try to make naloxone over the counter, which it still is not to this day. So it's a really interesting movement, and it's recounted in the book. And the other thing about the book is that when I was negotiating with MIT Press for illustrations, I overestimated. I thought, oh, I'm going to just ask for a ridiculous number. A ridiculous number being 40 illustrations in this book. But they just gave it to me. And so luckily I had found the Santa Cruz Needle Exchange, which did this amazing zine called Junk Food in the 1990s and early 2000s. And Brooke Lober and Heather Edney, the two people who put that together, these volumes, there were 2 volumes of the Book of Death, they recount subjective experiences of overdose, and they contain both visual and verbal accounts of overdose that were really unlike anything else that I had ever read. And so the book is made all that more rich because of what I would call this kind of social movement art, protest art, right? This is something that brought home to me, right, how very personal this movement, the politics of this movement really has been. This is a politics of life and death. And so I leave you with that, and I'm eager to hear about your questions, and thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, for that really interesting work. Your book is on my shelf, and I'm really looking forward to starting it. I thought maybe, if you don't mind, as I could take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. So I'm curious. You showed a couple charts, where there's this familiar rapid increase in OD deaths. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the politics of counting and how numbers get generated. And I know it's a hard topic to talk about. It's and there's issues, but it seems like a really central thing when we're talking about a process that is fundamentally based on numbers.
Yes, and also because some of you may know me through my vocation as a science and technology scholar, and we talk a lot about feminist epistemology and who counts as. And so counting is actually fundamental to the book because, of course, what counts as an overdose and how do overdose deaths get defined? How do they get characterized? I showed you the New York City graph in large part because the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in New York City was across the world one of the most authoritative places for defining the criteria by which a death gets categorized as an overdose death. And of course, as you're probably all aware, it's very contentious how these deaths are categorized. One of the other main arguments I make in some of the chapters is the difficulty of so many deaths that involve polydrug use. They may involve an opioid, they may involve a benzodiazepine, they may involve alcohol, but they'll be classified as an opioid overdose death. And so there are a variety of forensic conversations, I would say, that I try to talk about in the book, that I try to bring to people kind of as they were brought into the public domain. So there are a number of very interesting moments when overdose becomes very public in New York City in the 1960s, and often involving decedents of color. And so there are very interesting moments when there are these kinds of debates that are generally scientific debates, forensic debates, somewhat technical debates, become very public. And I was very interested in those. When does overdose come to matter to which publics? And also, of course, methadone overdose deaths, right, in New York City are also part of that chart that I showed you earlier in the presentation. And so all of these contentions, counting, categorization, right, certification, there's often a time lag in overdose deaths. And that is a problem to this day, that it's very difficult for those kinds of differentiations to be made in a timely way. There's also, you know, a relatively broken medical examiner, coroner system in the United States and in the UK, right? These problems are there in the UK as well. There are two different systems of counting in the UK. So it's a, you've just asked a question that is like the tip of the iceberg. And I do hope you all get the book and read my attempts to make sense of that very interesting question of who or what counts as an overdose death.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the answer. So it's about 5 o'clock my time, or I guess 4 o'clock your time. So the session is supposedly technically over now. There's a lot of questions in the chat though. So if you don't mind, Nancy, if we could go a little bit later, I think that'd be wonderful. Okay, so we have a question from Luke, who says that your visuals are really stimulating. And he'd like to know a little bit about the blend of social, political, and medical analyses in the book. And then maybe kind of as you answer that, you could also answer a question from David Hertzberg, who's asking about whether or not activists made an effort to challenge and or redefine what medical authorities accepted as evidence, right? So there's a question about evidence, and then there's another question from Daniel Wolf, who asks, what counts as evidence of efficacy?
Yes, hi. I interviewed Daniel for the book, and several of my other interviewees are on this call too. So hello to all of you. I hope you've enjoyed the first flush of publicity despite the pandemic. All right, so the visuals, yes. I was surprised at how many of the visuals I could find, because of course in the early days of this research there weren't very many, and I had looked at this topic years ago before it became a thing, and I hadn't really been able to find very much. And so with the advent of the internet and the fact that these things can now be archived and located, it really changed what I could do. I was tempted. There were times when I was writing the book when I just wanted to write about the public representation, the cultural representation and the cultural production around overdose. I do write a lot about that, but not nearly as much as I wanted to, because I also had in mind telling the story, telling your story, telling the story, which of course is part of the book, right? The stories that I told today about NALORPHINE and so forth is also part of the book, right? It's and so I wanted to be able to tell this long story about the history of overdose and how it becomes, in a sense, a thing, to have a social life. But I also wanted to be able to analyze some of the cultural production. I tend to do a lot more of that in talks than I was able to do in the book, because I feel like people are often coming to this topic with a lot of their own experiences, and I wanted to be true to those experiences, and I wanted to, because I'm sincerely and genuinely impressed with the cultural production, with the social movement, with the harm reduction activism, which often took place, at least in the United States, in ways that, I mean, you know, people went to jail, you know, people were in lawsuits. I mean, that there were, people really took on personal levels of risk and professional risk, right? Particularly for the physicians the pharmacists and the people who were involved in the diversion of naloxone to the activists. This is a risky terrain, and I wanted to be able to tell the story, but not get like too far into the weeds, because I didn't want anybody, getting into trouble because of that. So there were a lot of internal debates over what counted as evidence, what counts as overdose, how we should be representing the alarming rates of overdose. Just look at those graphs. I mean, the front cover of the book, it actually is the graph. I'll just share for just 1 second. Let me see if I can just go back to it for just 1 second so I can show you it. It was a designer's, can I do that? Is that easy? Yes, I think I can do that. The designers at the MIT Press were able, oh, okay, it doesn't want to go to my new, all right, sorry, this is so ungraceful, but I will get there. The designers took the graph, this graph, this line, right, that goes through OD, is the CDC graph at a certain point in time, and they superimposed it onto OD in order to subtly make the point that indeed the book is about, in a sense, data and evidence, and how you function as an activist in an evidence-based world. That a lot of the book, the point is that activists had to get very involved in very technical research in order to have their testimony validated, right, in order to produce evidence and in order to survive and get what they wanted in an evidence-based world. So I think I'll end the answer to the question there.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Since you were just speaking about sort of activism and evidence and experiences, I thought there's two very interesting comments in the chat, one from Kelly Ramsey and one from Greg Higbee. And I'll read the comments, but I then thought maybe we could invite Kelly and Greg to kind of comment on their experiences. Kelly wrote that, wow, I was a volunteer with the Santa Cruz Needle Exchange in the 1990s and knew Heather and Brooke. That is how I became a harm reductionist and eventually an addiction medicine physician. So Kelly, if you would be interested in commenting on that, we'd love to hear your perspective. And the other one is from Greg Higbee, who writes, as a pharmacy student in the mid-1970s, I was taught to never use NALORPHINE if naloxone was available. When asked why NALORPHINE was used at all, the professor told us that some physicians like their addict patients to suffer.
Yeah, I have to respond to that. And then Kelly, I hope that you will jump in, because I would, of course, love to hear about your experiences in Santa Cruz, which is where Junk Food was published, although there was a lot of traffic with San Francisco and New York City among that crowd. Okay, so over antagonism, and if you look over antagonism up, what Greg Higbee is talking about still happens. And it was known to happen, for instance, in Glasgow. John Strang and Joanne Neal wrote an article on over-antagonism because Joanne Neal had happened to do interviews with Glaswegians exiting, they call them A&E departments, emergency departments, emergency rooms, having had naloxone reversals. And she interviewed them because it's well known in many localities. NALORPHINE was used punitively, and so was naloxone. And by that I mean that if you think about naloxone as an antagonist, if your dosage is too high of naloxone, dosage depends how much opioid somebody has in their system. If the dosage is too high, you will over antagonize, and that is where you will wake up, like the scene in Trainspotting, right, with a gasp. That kind of a wake up is really not pleasant at all, naloxone being clean or not, notwithstanding. And so, yes, this idea that some people like their patients to suffer so that they will stop using is still an unfortunate idea, and one, by the way, that I think there are many. Look, there's drug user unions all over the world. There is a human rights argument, right, to be made, even a cruel and unusual punishment kind of argument to be made about that. So, Kelly, if you'd like to jump in, I'd love to hear your experiences.
You guys hear me?
We can hear you. I don't
Okay, great. So I don't know if my video will work on this. Let me try. Yep. Oh, there I am. Okay. So I lived in Santa Cruz from about 1990 to 1998, and started volunteering at the Needle Exchange. I don't know, maybe around 92-ish, something like that. And I was working at a women's health center in Santa Cruz, the Santa Cruz Women's Health Center, and was really I was actually interested in HIV and hepatitis C, and that's what kind of spurred me to volunteer at the Needle Exchange. And what I loved about volunteering there is that it bust every myth I had ever learned about drug use and people who use drugs. So I grew up in suburban, white New Jersey, and everything I had learned was a lie about heroin, particularly. Being very close to Harlem and being very close to Paterson, New Jersey. And so what I found in working at the Needle Exchange was just that everybody had a story. And I've kind of carried that through my work in harm reduction. And then eventually I went to medical school, and now that's my career. So I've been treating opioid use disorder for 16 years. And I tell that story about working at the Needle Exchange because I think that's really important for people to understand. And I think that there's so much stigmatization and dehumanization of people who use drugs that nobody thinks about that individual that's behind it and what their story is and how they got to where they are. And if you took time to listen to people's stories, you would understand how they got where they are. But I guess volunteering at the Needle Exchange at that point in time, it was illegal in Santa Cruz. And so obviously we risked arrest every single time we did it, but the cops really just told us to move along, and didn't ever arrest any of us while we were there. But it was an amazing experience, and it completely radicalized my politics and changed my worldview, pretty much.
Yeah, so I lived in Santa Cruz from 90 to 95 myself, but I didn't volunteer at the Needle Exchange, although now, of course, I really wish I had thought I had more time in graduate school than I actually did. But thanks for, lifting up that kind of experience. That was what I was seeking. I was really trying to find, look, I mean, every activist I talk to, and many, many people are inspired as you are to enter their professions because of these kinds of experiences. And everyone had so much really passion and energy about what they had encountered in terms of the personal connections that they had made. And it counters the the idea that addiction is disconnection. It counters so many of the narratives that circulate in our space. And that is what I was seeking to do. I have in the book, I go into this whole thing about partisan, what does it mean to be a historian who has a point of view, a perspective, who's a partisan researcher that's explicit, right? We all do. But the question about how overt you make that and how much you declare that, and what does that do to people's understanding of your credibility and your evidence. In my case, I felt like it really did, and this goes to, I did tune into the chat there for a second. I think someone made a comment about junk food as the fantastic grassroots source that often doesn't make it into the archives. It took me years to find it, and it shouldn't have. I mean, you know, once I did, and now it's in the Internet Archive. There is a Society of Addiction Librarians called SALIS, S-A-L-I-S. You should all know about it because they have partnered with the Internet Archive in San Francisco to put a lot of this ephemera as well as research articles into an Internet Archive. So SALIS is doing this work all over the world. This is a global organization. And I think it's really important. It's really important that we as historians don't just get access to official discourse, because so much of what was happening in my domain was not happening. And in fact, I also tell that story when I was doing this research on buprenorphine in New York State and the way in which evidence-based, the way in which something that counted as an evidence-based practice, i.e. buprenorphine, was phased into New York State, I was doing a lot of participant observation. I was going to all these meetings with the state agency, OASIS, and listening to the way that people talked about buprenorphine. And this was 2003, and nobody mentioned overdose. Like no one talked about overdose at all in those. It was like this massive silence, even though this is a time, right, when we know we are in the midst of this, that graph that I showed you, you know, when things are beginning to uptick. And so I think it's really interesting how we, as historians, gain access to, in my case, I've had to turn to interviews, to oral histories. People have amazing stories, and anybody who was paying attention to naloxone in the early 2000s, you know, has amazing stories. I don't want to out anybody, but let me just see. Right. Okay. So one of my interviewees is on here, and you know, he recalls being, you know, arrested with boxes of naloxone in his car. And police asking, you know, what it is and saying he shouldn't have it, et cetera. Right. So I think that there is, that historians need to do more of this. I think of myself as a historian of the present. I don't know where the naloxone story is going next, but I'm, you know, I have a lifetime of work of that, I'm sure. So thanks for that contribution, Kelly.
I'll just have to say, because you just mentioned OASIS, I'm actually the Associate Chief of Addiction Medicine at OASIS. So
we must live across
OASIS
the river
has changed
from each other. So definitely find me. I'm at our PI in Troy.
Which my dad is a graduate of. That's so fun.
Right, so I think we'll have one more question and then we'll call it an evening. This is a really, really wonderful discussion, but I know that Nancy has some other obligations that she needs to get to. So maybe for the last question of the evening, we have one from Richard Del Rio, who asks that the recent scholarship has shown that about 80% of opioid overdoses have had stimulants with them, and just so what does that provoke? What kind of response does that provoke for you, Nancy?
Yeah, so this is a polydrug using culture, and that's been known for a long time. You know, people, you know, historically, Richard always has the best questions. Historically, of course, speedballs, you know, mixtures of heroin and cocaine were not uncommon. And so I don't think that that's a change so much as a modulation in the polydrug story. And part of the problem of opioid overdose is that it's always discussed as if the only thing that people are using is opioids, and that is very rarely the case. And I think so another interesting aspect of this kind of history, for me at least, has been coming to understand how important it is that I involve clinicians and pharmacologists, researchers, in what I'm doing, so that I understand enough to function in this arena. And that has now expanded to really thinking about epidemiology and about, again, how these claims are made and how they are represented and framed in public. So yeah, I think polydrug is a better way to think about overdose, but it's the, naloxone only is active in response to the opioid receptor, right? And it's active because it has greater affinity for that opioid receptor than anything else that's already on it. And so it doesn't matter, in a sense, what else there is in the system. Although I think there's some evidence that naloxone acts on other respiratory depressants, although I don't think that's as clearly understood. Naloxone is a deceptively simple molecule, and so I think that is, it's always puzzling, it's always a mystery, it's always interesting to me to hear there are new formulations of it. There are new products that, new routes of administration, I guess I'll call them. In other words, I think we're going to be seeing and hearing from people who have novel naloxones or new naloxones in the future. And there are other narcotic antagonists out there that are doing possibly interesting things therapeutically and in this more emergent situation that I'm talking about. So thanks all of you. Thanks everybody. It was really great to see you. I wish we were in person because I would love to see so many of you in person. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nancy. And thank you to everybody for a wonderful conversation. All right, take care, everybody.